Howdy, another chessboard coming your way. I really like this one. I think it came out really neat with the maple burl, the Wenge squares, the walnut base, and the maroon epoxy highlights. Hope you enjoy the video, and welcome to Howdies. I started as I normally do with a 16 by 16 half-inch MDF base. I measured and marked 2-inch squares for the pieces. I then cut 2x2 columns out of some really pretty maple burl I found on eBay. The original idea was to cut the squares out of the ends of each column, but after taking a look at the grain patterns, I really liked the edge grain and the texture. So instead, I cut each of the column into half-inch strips. I then cut my 2-inch squares out of each strip to make sure that the best view of the maple burl was on the outside. As I was cutting, I measured a test piece to make sure that it was exactly 2 inches by 2 inches, and then cut all the remaining 32 pieces with my stop block and table saw sled. I laid the pieces out on the base, and I put them in the order that I wanted. It's always best to lay them out and figure out how they look best before you glue them down. I then stacked them accordingly and readied them for the glue up. I carefully glued the maple pieces onto the base, making sure the glue covered all the bottom side of each square. This is important to avoid gaps and potential epoxy bubbles. A little glue run out is not an issue since the accent epoxy color, the maroon, is darker and it will end up covering any of the dried glue along the MDF base. Using shellac, I coated the tops and sides of each square. I was generous with the shellac as I wanted it to soak into the maple burl and fully seal and solidify the pieces. Maple burl can have gaps and soft areas, so allowing the shellac to soak into the pieces will reduce the bubble issues later. I then turned to the Wenge squares. Using my table saw sled and stop block, I cut the 32 alternating Wenge squares. As with my other chessboards, I cut the Wenge squares a little smaller so that I could add some accent epoxy color between them. These Wenge squares were cut just under 1.8 inches on each side, and as with the others, they were a half-inch deep. After cutting, I sanded the edges to remove the feathers. I then did another round of shellac for the maple burl pieces and used the dunking method, where in essence I just dunked all the sides of the Wenge to seal those squares as well. Wenge is a beautiful wood, but it really does have some holes in the grain, even the edge grain, so coating them with shellac will reduce any epoxy bubbles later. After the shellac dried, I glued the Wenge squares onto the MDF baseboard. A quick reminder on the chessboard setup. The board is set up where each player has a darker square on the left side of their board. You will want to consider that with the grain pattern of the wood that you are gluing the pieces onto. For woods like Wenge, where the grain pattern flows in one direction, make sure it is to your preference. On this one, I put the grain pattern running top to bottom on the board. Obviously, you set it how you like it. Next step was adding the epoxy highlights. I mixed up some resin and used eye candy, Yamagata Red pigment for the color. I carefully poured the resin between the squares and filled the edges. Ideally, you want the epoxy to come just over the edges of each piece so that when you flatten the top, you do not have any gaps or low spots in the epoxy. By the way, if you want to learn how to make these chessboard molds that you see me using, click the link above. Once dried, I removed the chessboard from the mold and cleaned up the silicone from the edges. As I've said in the other videos, the less silicone you use, the better. I cleaned up and squared the edges on the table saw for all 4 sides and moved over to the drum sander. I ran the piece through the drum sander multiple times to flatten the top. As mentioned, if you use too little epoxy and there are low spots, then you will be stuck at the very slow drum sander for a long time to finally get the top flat. Next was adding the siding. To match the board, I decided to use Wenge siding for this one. I cut 4 strips of the siding and glued them on using CA glue along with the accelerator. Since we are gluing to epoxy, I chose CA glue over wood glue. I cleaned up the overlaps using the table saw and used my random orbital sander to try and get the edging aligned with the top. For good measure, and to assure the top was completely flat prior to my top coat, I ran the board back through the drum sander a few times. Once the top was flat, I used a top coat of shellac. Obviously, after running it through the drum sander multiple times, the raw wood is exposed. So adding a layer or two of shellac will make the grain and the color pop, and at the same time, it will seal the wood prior to the epoxy top coat. Once the shellac dried, I mixed up some clear epoxy and used it as a final top coat over the entire board. Once the top coat dried, I sanded the drips from the bottom of the board and cleaned it with mineral spirits. I sprayed some Gorilla Glue adhesive and added some felt to the bottom of the board. And although not shown in the video, I used a straight edge along with a razor blade to trim the felt, and then I drilled 4 small holes and added 4 rubber feet to the bottom of the board. You can find these rubber feet on Amazon for fairly cheap. I'm not covering the build of the frame as I've already covered it in pretty good detail in the last video. If you want to check out how the frames are made, take a look at the link above. For the pieces on the board, I used the same pigment, Eye Candy Yamagata Red, so it would match the board, and I created a simple white set for the other side. That's it. Hope you enjoyed the build. I really like the maple burl and how the squares look, especially against the dark Wenge. This was one of my favorite boards I built. Thanks for watching, and please feel free to like, comment, and follow for more upcoming builds. See you soon, and thanks again for watching.